Dr. Tharoor is a Member of Parliament. He former Minister of State for External Affairs. He also heads the Standing Committee on External Affairs in the Parliament right now, and of course had a long and distinguished career at the United Nations. Dr. Tharoor, many people have interpreted the election of Donald Trump as a reversal of globalization, and as sort of the result of a lot of anger against the forces of globalization. I know you've just written a book about the British Empire. Does this vote in some way signal the beginning of the end, or perhaps the end of the American Empire?
Thank you, Dhruva. That's a very good question. My book is called An Era of Darkness, and I certainly hope we're not about to initiate a new era of darkness in world affairs, and perhaps not. I think before I answer that question, because in a sense it's a fairly straightforward answer, I'd like to comment briefly on two things relating to what my very good friend Arun Kumar Singh said. One is on this whole Pakistan angle that I heard a lot of Indian armchair critics on television and so on feeling very complacent about the fact that with Trump coming now, he will take India's side because he's the one who's said throughout the campaign that radical Islamist terrorism is the biggest threat to the world and so on. But what I think our people are in danger of forgetting is that's exactly what the Pakistani generals say. They say radical Islamist terrorism is a terrible threat, and we are the best bulwarks against it. So give us more money, give us more support. And the Americans have bought this line for 2 successive administrations at least, and have pumped in $11 billion in military assistance in the last 2 administrations. Why should we necessarily assume it'll be any different? They're extremely good at selling their point of view in Washington, and as I said, the Americans do appear to have swallowed this in the past. The second comment is about the Indian-American presence, which of course Rich Verma also mentioned in his speech. I don't know how many of you are on social media. I was busy looking at my phone. Social media at the moment is absolutely flooded with stories of post-election racism against Indians in America. It's quite alarming. There's one chap who's a well-heeled, light-skinned, as he goes out of his way to point out, Indian in a suit, who was shouted at a petrol pump by a group of Trump supporters saying, "Time to go home now, Apu." Apu being a character on The Simpsons, who's an Indian. So, I mean, these are the kinds of, if you like, negative currents against the slightly more positive approach that Arun and his counterpart here, Rich Verma, has taken. These are both very good, important angles for India to think about, but please let us not assume that it's going to work out exactly the way in which our armchair pundits on television seem to think it will. Now, coming back to Dhruv's question. I think the answer is very simply yes, Dhruv. I mean, the truth is that there is now a widespread current in many parts of the world against, if you like, the Davos consensus of the last couple of decades. The consensus that globalization was good for the world, that all tides would rise, all boats would rise, that economic growth would be a characteristic of this, I think really ran into major headwinds with the 2008 recession. And after the recession hit, suddenly all the things that were buried under the carpet but were simmering beneath the surface came right out. Resentment of the working class, that the people who are supposed to speak for their interests, in other words, the liberals, if you like, or the left in some countries, were in fact in bed with the corporate elite, the Wall Street crowd. I mean, poor Hillary suffered definitely much more than we realized initially from those speeches on Wall Street, simply because the feeling was that the working class no longer had a champion on the left side of the issue, that their jobs were being outsourced to China, and that, of course, or to India for that matter. You remember the period in which there was the expression that our jobs have been Bangalored. Bengaluru doesn't quite sound quite as effective, but still, I mean, that thinking is not absent. And the backlash has been apparent, it seems to me, not just in America, but in many other countries. Certainly you're seeing it in Europe. The far-right Dutch leader, Geert Wilders, said yesterday The Americans have taken back their country and now it's our turn. Marine Le Pen seems to be in every poll one of the top two contenders for the French presidency. Jobbik is on the rise in Hungary, and indeed the Viktor Orban is not much to the left of Jobbik. You've got in some ways one could argue that Brexit actually crystallized at the European level and in Britain a phenomenon which is truly worldwide. And perhaps if one were to look a little further back, the victories of both Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Modi can be seen. Mr. Erdogan in Turkey and Mr. Modi in India both argued for a move away from the old assumptions of the cozy establishment in favor of a more robust, more natively rooted, more inward-looking cultural nationalism, except I agree that in Mr. Modi's case, the economic policies have been still very much in the direction of globalization, but certainly the phenomenon that I described earlier has a certain forerunner in these two earlier victories as well. Now, where do we go from here? I mean, I think anti-globalization is actually here to stay, and we're going to have to take a good look at it. If Mr. Trump does half of what he threatened to do during the election campaign, there's going to be some rather dramatic changes in the way in which the world is run. You will see certainly more protectionist policies. You've got a sympathetic legislature that will no longer have a person sitting in the White House to veto equivalents of Glass-Steagall and all these other earlier protectionist era acts. You're going to find, it seems to me, real possibilities of a shake-up in America's attitude to NATO, America's presence to the South China Sea, America's attitudes to the EU. After all, don't forget, Trump celebrated Brexit. He was in Scotland to inaugurate a golf course, and he said, wow, the Brits have done the right thing. This is not a man who's expressed much sympathy for global integrative forces, quite the contrary. So I think that we're all going to be in for some very interesting times. And certainly, as it is, I think Make in India was in peril for other reasons, because, we are trying to attract jobs through cheaper labor at a time when the rest of the world is moving more and more towards automation, and more of those jobs are actually going to be returned to the developed world, where robots will make things that Chinese could make cheaper till recently. And on top of that, we're also going to be trying to sell goods in markets where the barriers are going to go up and where there are going to be fewer purchases as well. So I think the world is in for some slightly turbulent times, and this may well be the harbinger of a new era. Yes, you're right.